He has wiped out by his grace through faith in Christ your every sin, past, present, future.
Christian hedonist is somebody who says that my greatest joy, my greatest good is God. And therefore, I will pursue that joy and I will pursue that God above all else. So God's glorified and I'm satisfied.
You are now listening to the Pastor Discussions podcast.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode number 102-ish of the Pastor Discussions podcast. I'm John.
We went backwards in episodes.
No, we're on 102. Last week was 101.
No, we are like at 109.
Oh, 112. That's what it is. 112-ish. I said ish.
But I was like, we've been going up with our
true.
issues. Now we just went back. Anyway. Okay, this is your mostly weekly conversation on
and he's
doctrine,
Joe.
faith, and the Christian life. And yes, and I'm Joe.
So, sorry for last week. The audio quality was absolutely atrocious because for some reason, either I didn't plug in the USB because I had to unplug it to use that USB connector for something else, or I didn't switch it over in the computer when we started recording. And so it was just recording with our regular computer audio.
I would make you a checklist, but you would just not use it anyway.
It just goes to show you that no matter how long you do this, there's always days where things happen imperfectly. And I think that, like, it's learning to embrace that. Like, learning to embrace the imperfection of life and learning from those imperfections. And so what happened was, when we recorded last week, we had a unique...
But you actually have to learn from them.
We had a unique experience. Do you like that?
You tried really hard.
That was good. It was just like smooth as butter. Okay, so
all right. So last week we talked.
Yeah, we're part of the Bar Podcast Network.
Yeah, do yours.
Yeah,
I know it's important.
It's important. Like there's some newish episode or newish podcasts that have been added. So be sure to check those out at thebarpodcast.com, and then check out the Think Podcast with Joel Sedekase, and now Experiences.
So last week we talked about relationships, and that's like 1/3 or the first leg of our three-legged table.
Who makes a three-legged table? We need it's a stool. Nobody makes a table with three legs.
Coffee tables, round tables,
like end tables. End tables can't really hold anything.
Have you ever sat on one?
All right, whichever metaphor you prefer, use that in your head.
Okay, so we talked about relationships. So the next piece to this, as far as like this authentic discipleship that we're going to talk about, is experiences.
So before you jump into that, let me just say, if you're not familiar with what we're talking about, go back and listen to episode 110
or something,
The last episode, 111. The premise of this is, we're focusing primarily on discipleship, but I think we should just note that this has all sorts of applications beyond what we traditionally think of as discipleship. This has implications for, like, your friendships with unbelievers. This has implications for your parenting, which in that we'll come back to that, but all of that is discipleship in some way.
Right. This is how we're wired to function, though, to learn, to grow, to engage with others. This is how it happens, whether we have identified that in our lives or we haven't. This is at its core what happens in our learning and growing and building relationships.
And to be fair, what we're trying to do is we're trying to shake up the paradigm that seems to be prominent in the church of what discipleship is or what the church should be about. Because what we tend to think of discipleship as is we tend to think of discipleship as a class or a Bible study or something like that, where it is essentially primarily a transfer of information. And what we're challenging is discipleship is much broader than what we tend to think of it as. And it has these principles that Jesus used that make it effective. In other words, you can just give information and walk people through a class or through a course or through something like that, but it can be missing these other two elements. And in that case, it's not really, I don't think, biblical discipleship. So that's sort of the context. That's what we're trying to accomplish with this sort of like mini series that we're doing on relationships, experiences, and information. So with that, experiences.
So before we do go there, I wanted. So I thought about this after
Longest caveats ever.
Well, but after we got done recording last time, one of the things we had talked about in relationships is being okay with whatever relationship you have.
Yeah.
And so in that, we need to also understand that relationships change. And you and I were talking about this a little bit. There should not be a feeling of, how many people you think feel pressure to have specific relationships or have, 20 or however many, every relationship you have should be at the same level. Well, there's that pressure, but there's also pressure to maintain relationships without taking a step away and seeing that maybe something has changed in lives that has grown you apart, and your relationship has gone from tier 1 to a tier 2 relationship. We should be okay with that.
So, example, illustration, when we moved here, Jeff, who was, I would consider, he was my best friend in Missouri, old enough to be my dad and treated me like a son. But he was the most influential person in my life in Missouri. And we have, to this day, a great relationship. When we go back to Missouri, it's like I said this last week, but it's like going home, and we just pick up where we left off, and it's great, but then we leave and come back here. Our relationship is not the same as it was when we were living there. And there's something changed. That change was us moving geographically up here away from them. And that changes the relationship. And Lewis is helpful with this, right? With the thrill, the whole thing with the thrill, like let the thrill go. He talks about, how we're chasing thrills and we experience a thrill and then we want to hold on to it, or we want to, recreate it in some artificial way and not let it go. And he said that really the completion of the joy comes in letting the thrill go and the memory of the thrill. So I have incredibly fond memories of my time in Missouri and my relationship with Jeff and others there. But us moving meant that those relationships changed a little bit. They're still good. I still talk to them regularly. We still visit. It's a tier 2 relationship, but it's changed. And it's, if you hold on to that and you try to recreate that, you're not letting the thrill go and opening yourself up to what God has for you in that new phase. So that's sort of an illustration.
So I just wanted to warn against two things. One, there shouldn't be, if you are in one of those tier 1 friendships or tier 2 and it moves to something that it's not as in your mind good as it was before, or intimate or as close. One, you shouldn't feel guilty for that.
Right.
And two, you shouldn't feel envy or should be upset about that either. If whichever side of that you're on, except that in most cases, and part of this is communicating too with each other and just saying, we're just in different places now. It's not that we don't care about one another. It's just that for a time it was here at this tier. Now it's not. Accept that. Be thankful. Like you were talking about, let the thrill go. Be thankful for that and be thankful for what you have, and realize that there are other relationships that have probably moved into that spot and you just haven't realized it yet.
I think the important thing is,
be okay with those things changing. It doesn't have to stay the same for forever.
Right. And I think the important thing is make sure you have those relationships.
You're right.
Like if you perpetually have like a tier 1 relationship and then it moves out and you never replace that, that's a problem. Like if you don't have those tight, intimate relationships. So I think maybe a summary of last week is make sure you have relationships in those different tiers or whatever. That it sounds so cold, but in those different levels of relationship that we as humans experience. But don't assume, sort of like spiritual gifts, don't assume just because you have a certain spiritual gift that you're going to have that forever. God changes things. He brings different people into our lives in different ways to help us grow differently and for different seasons. Yep. So be okay with that.
Okay. So with that caveat, let's
get into the show.
I just think that's super important.
It is.
I think a lot of people struggle with when relationships change, they never replace that relationship, or it has been, God's brought that person and they're not seeing it. and they're not being thankful for it.
And like you said, there maybe it's like there's such a attachment to the way things were in the past, that it can prohibit or hinder moving forward in those different relationships.
It can also close us off because
that's sort of what I was saying.
You can feel hurt or whatever, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, I don't want to do that again. Yeah. It's like, don't be like that.
And then I think that, oh man, longest intro ever. But I think that has a really important implication for the relationships that we do have, namely to be thankful for them and enjoy them as we have them. I mean, if you're constantly living in fear of, is this relationship going to stay the same forever? Or I wish that I had the relationship that I had in the past. You're just perpetually not being able to enjoy the things that God has given now. And I think that for a lot of us, we need to learn, it's a secret of contentment. It's being content with where God has us and what he's placed in our lives and being thankful for that, as opposed to always looking forward or looking back.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Okay. So tied into that is experiences. And one of the things that brings a relationship is common experience. So you've talked a lot about this, the what you two moment.
Yeah.
So let's maybe talk about how that experiential thing actually bonds us. And I think it's implied, but there's information in that too, right?
Yeah. So, this again, Lewis, C.S. Lewis talked about friendship begins the moment when you say, what you two, I thought I was the only one. And, so I'll just use a really seemingly innocuous illustration from our relationship. We both have an affinity for Star Trek.
It's shamefully true.
It's not shamefully true. It would be shamefully true if it was like Stargate or something like that. That would be shamefully true. Star Trek is amazing. At any rate, but we discovered this, and then as we talked, we discovered that there was a common love of Friends and like
the show.
Yeah. and that just kind of built, and we had these like what you two moments, and those what you two moments happened in the context of experiences and information. So all of this bleeds together. Like one of the things that's really important with this is we don't elevate one and minimize the others. They're equally important, and they play different roles.
Right. And when we break this up into 3 talks, it can kind of elevate them one over the other.
It can seem like one, like they're disconjointed or something. But that those experiences offer the opportunity to build friendships that move beyond just acquaintances. So sharing common experiences is a means by which we bond together and we learn more about one another, and we develop a love for one another in reality. I mean, you think about how much of your relationship with your spouse is built on shared experiences, and how those experiences form and mold and shape and grow your relationship, and how they provide opportunities for information. So just this last week, my wife and I went out on a date, and this was the first time, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but this is the first time we've really gone out together, just the two of us, in like a year, outside of like maybe a little thing here or there, or doing something after the kids go to bed. But Ollie, our youngest, has been a terrible sleeper. Carly felt guilty putting a babysitter in that situation. And so anyway, we finally went out together, and that experience of just sitting down and enjoying a meal together led to a couple of things. It led to, number one, growing affection for one another. And number two, it facilitated conversation and interaction where we were communicating with one another
in a different way than happens.
In a unique way. Now, when we talk about experiences, I think it's important to highlight that we're not just talking about like earth-shattering experiences. We're not just talking about like these big things that we tend to think about when we think about experiences, like weddings or funerals or births of a child. Those are experiences. Those are sort of like those big experiences. And I sort of coined this phrase in the sermon on experiences. It's divinely appointed monotony. It's serendipitous moments of divinely appointed monotony. Serendipitous is just a happy discovery, a happy and unexpected discovery in divinely appointed monotony. So experiences, let me give you another example. Last night I took my girls out and we just camped out in the backyard. That wasn't a big thing. It was big for them. And that was an experience. But there's also other experiences, like we try to just sit together and talk during meals. That's an experience. So when we're talking about experiences, we got to be careful not to jump to this sort of like, oh, we got to take a massive vacation and that's the experience. Well, that's one, but there are other experiences that happen every day that we overlook because they're monotonous. They're things that we don't normally notice because they happen so commonly. And so when we're talking about experiences, we're talking about redeeming those things that are normative in our lives and can be overlooked for the sake of building relationships and communicating information. Reading.
Do you really think you have to think of it that way, though? Like, to be like, this isn't something that we have to be extremely intentional in doing. This happens. Maybe we have to be intentional in
recognizing
it.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about intentional in making it happen, like manufacturing something. That's a good clarification. I'm talking about being intentional of recognizing the reality that it happens and seeing those as important things. For us, and again, I'm just going off of personal experience here. For us, reading is one of those things. As a family, I read to our girls, and that can be viewed as a chore sometimes because they'll bring me a book and say, "Papa, will you read to me?" And I really don't feel like it because, I just got home from work or there's something else that's on my mind or whatever. But taking in that experience, the cumulative effect of reading to my kids, one instance might not make a big difference, but it's opened up all sorts of opportunities for conversation and it's fostered the relationship. So experiences are essential. And part of the reason experiences are essential is because we're experiential beings. So when God created us, he created us to experience his world. He didn't just create us to know about it. He created us to experience. He gave us senses. He gave us emotions. He gave us the experience of working to earn a living, the experience of falling in love, the experience of discovering something you didn't know existed, the experiences of losing someone in death. All of those things, our whole lives are full of experiences. We're experiential beings. And so part of the value of experiences is we're created to experience God, and we're created to experience God in the context of this world that he's created and his word and our relationships. So experiences provide the foundation or the opportunity. They're kind of the proving ground for developing relationships and also for communicating information.
So I think some of the bigger things to take away from that is don't discount the small experiences trying to pursue only big experiences.
Exactly.
And don't get blinded to those small things that accumulate over time. And just at the expense because at their expense, you're just looking for those big experiences and you're focused on those. And those are the only things that are be groundbreaking and will actually make a difference. So
learn to rejoice in what we might consider lesser thrills.
Right. Like being committed to sitting around the dinner table and having a meal together. That's an experience that so many, especially now, take for granted. It can be a chore. Well, that's going to take more time. We don't have the time to do that. It's like, no, value that experience and the repetitive nature of sitting down together and eating a meal together.
There was a Puritan, I think it was a Puritan theologian, I can't remember his name, but he told this story about this father who was walking with his child and swooped up this child in a hug and told him that he loved him. Now, there's a relationship there, father-child. He could have just said, "I am your father, and I love you." And that's communicating information. I mean, that's the thing. But there was something in the experience of swooping this child up in his arms and hugging him and kissing him and saying, "I love you." That experience matters. So, even for parenting, when you're correcting your child, kneeling at their level, that's an experience of of communication, an experience of solidarity, experience of affection, like hugging your kids, like all of these things that we see as ordinary. How many people have been shaped by not experiencing the love of their parents in an unconditional way? It's continuous. It's exposure and consistency. Those are the two sort of things with experiences like that, and like normal experiences, like ordinary, lesser thrills.
So let's jump into how, because we kind of hung on how experience and fosters relationship, right? And I think that one's easier to see versus the experience fosters information.
Yeah.
So you were just mentioning that there was information given as the child is swooped up and given a hug within the context of relationship. So you see all three of them there. So how does that happen on a normative basis? Like, I don't think of it as one is needed for the other, but the information that we take in is always done in the context of experience, whether we view it that way or not.
Exactly.
Sitting in a worship service is an experience. Sitting down and talking with another person is an experience. What are the dangers of only trying to take in information one way?
Yeah.
So like I'm thinking like reading a textbook, sitting in a lecture, having somebody else give you the information, studying for a test and writing all the answers down and trying to pass the test.
Right.
Like, what are the dangers of only getting information that way?
So I think the biggest danger is it becomes an intellectual exercise and doesn't ever move in and migrate into living. So think about all the things that you've learned. How many of them are solidified and confirmed and increased through doing?
Isn't it about like how much, like we talk about this all the time, but how much of a sermon can you remember versus the lyrics of a song when you sing it and you love it? Like, and what's the difference in those two things?
Both are important, and both have a role and a place, and it's the singing, and that's why we structure services the way that we do. Singing solidifies truth. You're actually participating, and we can talk about participating in the sermon. That's a whole nother conversation, because you should be doing that. But in the corporate singing, there's a participatory element that is different, that actually helps to solidify that truth. Like even thinking about like thinking about training pastors. You can go to seminary and you can get a lot of book knowledge, and that's good. Like, I mean, I'm not discounting the value of information. We'll get to that next week. But for me, I chose not to just attend seminary on campus, because I was able to practice ministry in a local church setting in Missouri. And I'll be honest with you, I learned so much through that process, through that experience, that I would not have learned if I had I would have learned it, but I would have learned it like in a church setting where I was hired from the outside, getting paid, and there was not as much grace and not as many people that were for me that would come alongside and correct and help shape. When we talk about teaching our kids to eat with a fork, you don't just give them a lecture on how to do it. First, you model it for them. There's the relationship aspect, and they see that, they want to be like that, and then they start taking these elementary steps. You get them a fork that's their size, and you accept the mess that comes with it, and you give them correction and advice and help them to grow in that, and that's how you learn to eat with a fork.
Yeah. This is why identifying that you're always taking information in an experiential way is so important. And
yeah.
What's the goal? So too many people, I think, have like, let's take a sermon, right? Have gone to, I need to take all the notes down. I need to get all the points down. I need to get every thought down that comes. but when we sing songs, we don't even think that way.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a disconnect to me, that people aren't getting that music is experiential, it's emotional, it drives the affections, but your brain can't shut off. Right. So you should be having both those things. The sermon is the same way, but what we've done is we've turned it into an intellectual exercise only, where we only write down
exactly
everything. And then the reason it has we tend to shut our notebook and then never come back to it and it not really have an impact, is because all it's done is it's gone into our heads and then out our ears.
Which comes down... Sorry, go ahead.
So I just want to give an example. So experiences, understanding it's an experience, but understanding how that experience actually benefits you is like not looking to take in all the content, like every other information gathering that we do is supposed to do. So you're cramming. We almost treat this stuff like cramming for a test.
Exactly.
I got to get all the information in so I can get all the right answers. And then once I get the answers, I'm done and I don't really go back to it. That's not how that works. Like, so some of this is identifying the experience and how the experience actually works to gather information and build relationship either with you and God or with you and other people.
And there is, in that instance that you were just describing, there is a responsibility both on the hearer and the preacher. So the responsibility of the hearer is to listen not just with the mind, but with the heart. And the responsibility of the preacher is not just to preach to the mind, but to preach to the heart. It's not just a transfer of information. It's a appeal to love differently. It's appeal to long for different things. It's showing the worth and value of something as superior to these other things in an aim of the heart loving rightly.
Right. And so I just think in that setting, we forget that we're experiencing something.
Exactly.
And we don't see the value of feeling that experience through the process of taking in information and let that take a hold and affect us. When you're sitting in a sermon, you should come away with 10% of what was said. That's all you're going to come away with anyway. But if you come away with that one thing that you sat and took all that information in, and there's that one thing that God had for you in that, and
it impacted you,
and there can be 100 or 200 or 5,000 different things that are said that impact different people.
Right.
It's like, that's what you should be grasping onto, not I have to write everything down, I have to take all this in. That is a information heavy, head knowledge way of, and it's just I think it's a lack of grasping and understanding what it is that's happening.
Yeah.
That this is an experience. It's meant to be an experience. I learn through this experience. I need to balance those things out when I'm taking that in.
We're experiencing the grace of God mediated through the preaching of his word. And that's an important distinction to make. Like, are you looking to experience his grace through conviction, through affirmation, through correction, all those different things? That's all experience.
So when we went to T4G the first time, I can remember one thing from that conference, one thing. And it's had a lasting impact, but I had to experience it to see it and to believe it. And it's impacted how I build relationships with people, how I've built relationships with you through the planning of services. And that one thing that impacted me is that worshiping in song can be done in what the world would say is a very bland musical way, and it can be impactful and it can be passionate.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be flashy. It doesn't have to have a ton of instruments. It doesn't even have to have your preference. It can be as simple, so this is when Coughlin was leading it, but it can be as simple as a guy with a piano and a ton of people singing.
Who loves Jesus and a bunch of people that love Jesus.
And it can just be old, quote unquote, boring hymns.
Yep.
They're not boring but that experience, it took that experience being there and seeing that passion and seeing it done for God to show me that. it wasn't just somebody telling me. Like, I could have somebody tell me that all day long, and I'd be like, okay, it's not going to work that way. That's not the best way to do it.
And that's where the value of experience is in teaching, because experience models something.
Right. But what I'm saying is I had the information. Right. And that somebody had told me that information, and they had logical reasoning for that information. And of course you got the same on the other side.
Right. Yeah.
But until I had experienced it and been a part of it, and there's some relational aspect, right? So we're there together.
Yeah.
And then there's conversations around that afterwards that I even remember having the conversations like, this was not my preference. And when we started, I was like, oh my, this is not going to be great. And by the time that weekend was over, it was like, okay, my whole perspective on that has changed now. Now, do I go that far? No. But I saw something, experienced something that was different than what I thought, even though I knew that information from other people.
Right.
Like, that experience solidified the information that I had.
Yeah.
And now I have a new paradigm in which I function as a pastor who plans worship services.
And I think it's important to highlight, like, when you think about this experience thing, first of all, we're talking a difference between experience and experientialism. Experientialism is where experiences are the benchmark or the litmus test for truth and for reality. That's not what we're arguing. We are arguing that experiences serve a role in the forming, shaping, teaching, instructing, changing, transforming of God's people. So just read through the Gospels and just take note of the different experiences that happen. I mean, Jesus raising Lazarus, he lets Lazarus die so that they can experience that he is the resurrection. He takes the disciples out on a boat so they can experience that he is God when he calms the storm. They
experience fish and bread not running out for thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah, and they participated in that. Like, the experience of sending out the 72 in groups of twos, and then coming back, and they're like, oh, even demons have to believe or have to obey us. And Jesus is like, whoa, it gives them an opportunity to correct, to adjust their thinking. The experience of sitting around and saying, who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Like, all of these things are happening in the context of experiences. Like, even the way that he talks are ways that relate to experiences. Look at the field is white and ready for harvest. This was an agrarian culture. They understood what that meant. And then they had experienced what a white field looked like. They looked out and they saw the field. And then he connects it with going and making disciples and spreading the gospel. Experiences are just all throughout Scripture as God shapes, even in our own lives, he shapes us through experiences. You experience sorrow or loss, and in that sorrow or loss, you're able to experience God's comfort in a unique way that you wouldn't have been able to experience outside of that sorrow or loss. So,
coming to faith is an experience.
Absolutely.
Like, is there information? Yes. Yeah. And is it normally done in the context of a relationship, whether it's somebody you just met or somebody that you know? Yes. But that seeing God, having the gospel penetrating the heart and responding, saying, yes, I want that. There's an experience that's happening. You're seeing God as valuable and as something that will bring you joy, someone who will bring you the most joy.
Yeah.
You see the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. That's an experience that changes the information that you know into something that's, oh, this is really valuable information. Yeah. If it's just cold and dead, and well, I know that information to be true, but if you don't experience and see that as valuable, I mean, we should be able to see that as like, one's here, one's just information.
Right.
But now that I've seen it, now that I've experienced it, like, why did Paul know the information about Jesus and not believe it until he had this experience of blinding and seeing Christ as valuable and good and glorious, and he instantly changed?
Not only that, like, Carly and I have talked about this a lot, but the experience of the first 5 years of our marriage and the absolute hell that it was for both of us, and fighting through that and forgiving one another and repenting to one another and all of the things that went into that has shaped our relationship to where now there will be something where we'll be arguing, disagreeing, and we'll just stop and laugh. Like, this is silly. Why are we? Let's figure this out. This is dumb. We're on the same team. Like, we've made it through all of this other stuff. We've seen God's faithfulness through all of this other stuff. We can figure this out together. We don't need to be at each other's throats. Experiences shape us, both either for the good or for the bad, which means then that all of our experiences that we have are valuable, both the positive ones and the negative ones, because God is at work in both of those in different ways. I think you said this when I can't remember the text that you were preaching on, but and it was in James. It was in James. It was teaching the high schoolers in James. You made the connection. Every good and perfect gift that comes from the Father comes from the Father of heaven, from where there's no shifting or changing. That's in the context of rejoice in suffering.
Yep.
So for a Christian, if you have a relationship with God, then every experience that you have is being used by God to shape and mold you. And therefore it has value, even if it's difficult to walk through.
It's a good gift.
It is. Yeah. And that's where the value of experiences happen, because experiences draw us into deeper fellowship with God, just like experiences draw us into deeper fellowship with one another. Experiences teach us about who God is as we experience his grace and goodness in different ways. Just like experiences with others teach us about who others are. Experiences teach us as we walk through something and maybe even reflect back on it afterwards and see how we were believing wrong or trusting wrong or loving wrong, in the same way that experiences in our own lives do that same thing with our relationships with others and the information that we have with others.
Okay, so let's finish on this. So I think we've talked about how experiences are supposed to work. Mm-hmm. What are some warning signs for people when they're getting close to being on the right side of experiences in the context of relationships and information versus going to experientialism? Because we have to be careful to not, like, yes, this is a part of it, but it's got to stay in balance, right?
Yeah.
To not go over that line into where you're just chasing experiences and you're chasing those affection highs, those emotional highs. That's what experientialism winds up doing. So what are some warning signs, or maybe what are some stopping points that you need to check yourself on, you think?
So I think that the biggest thing is two things that immediately come to mind. The first one is, if you're trying to recreate experiences, that's a problem. Like if you are, like, just take service planning. If in your service planning, you're trying to manipulate the environment and create an experience rather than recognizing that this is an experience and let it be what it is, and let the Spirit do whatever he does with it. But, we've got fundamental principles that we're working in, like the music and the sermon marry to one another and complement one another. The service is God-centered and God-focused. All of those things, yes, amen. But if you're trying to manipulate to produce a certain kind of experience, then that's a problem. And that happens in all sorts of different realms of life. That's just an example. But if you're trying to recreate something because it was impactful to you, that's a big warning sign. And then the other one, I think, is not being content in rejoicing in what we might consider lesser experiences that tend to be more normative in our lives. Like recognizing the experience of coming home and your child running out to you and giving you a big hug, and being content with that for what it is, right? We can overlook that and be looking forward to the next, like, big thing, or we can try to recreate that. When our kid doesn't come out, we're disappointed and feel like a failure. Like, both of those ditches, I think, are two big warning signs. If you're trying to recreate it, if you're not looking and recognizing and rejoicing in those experiences, those monotonous ones, or if you have something and it goes away and you're stuck trying to, like, with disappointment, as if, oh man, I'm never gonna have what I had then, type of thing. I think experiences come from, like, rightly interpreting experiences and rightly experiencing experiences come from a deeply rooted contentment and confidence that God is at work in our lives through everything that we go through, and that he's always present with us, and that each experience we have, from the biggest, most earth-shattering, like Damascus Road type ones, to writing a letter from a jail, or walking on a road with Timothy, like all of those are important and all of those matter. So I think really the big warning signs come with whether we're stuck
Mm-hmm.
on an experience, and whether we're longing for or disappointed in that we didn't get an experience.
I think one of the easier ways, maybe not easy ways, but one of the ways that we can see that is when you look back on an experience. Did you gain information? Did it foster relationship? Or was it
an end to itself?
Can you look back on that experience and say that actually fostered more relationship, or I learned this piece of information I didn't have? If all you come away with is, man, that felt good, I want to do that again, then you're probably in a dangerous spot where you've gone into experientialism versus
enjoying the serendipity of it.
Right. And it's good to do that, but experiences serve to grow relationships and to help us retain information. So if those two things aren't happening when you look back on it, it doesn't have to be big things, right?
Yeah.
But if all you can come away with is, that was a fun experience, or I liked how I felt, or whatever it is, where you kind of self-centered in it, I think that's a really dangerous place to be.
There was in the Space Chronicles by Lewis, there's a point where the main character goes to Mars, and the Martians are perfect beings, and they only have sex for a certain amount of time in their relationship, and the main character is like, what are you kidding me? And the Martian explains, like, this is a good thing, but don't discount the memory of it. The memory brings back the joy in a different way. It completes the joy in a different way. It kind of goes to Lewis's, like, trying to get an encore. Like we live in a world where if you like a song, you can listen to it over and over and over again. Yeah. And what happens? The first time you listen to it is different than the second time and the third time and everything else. So Lewis's point in all of that is, let experiences be what they are. Don't miss the serendipity of it. Don't miss the spontaneity of it and the joy that comes from it, because when you try to nail down that joy, it disappears. In Palalandra, he walks underneath this fruit that just explodes with this cool liquid all over him, and he's thrilled by it, and he sees all of them. He's like, what if I ran through all of them? Then all of them would explode on me. And he has this moment where he's like, but it wouldn't be the same. And I think when we just let experiences be what they are and appreciate them for what they are, without trying to recreate them or without lamenting the fact that we don't have what we wish we had, it allows us to actually experience God's world in a way that honors him, because all of those experiences serve to point us back to the Creator that provided them in the first place.
This all takes being a thoughtful people too. Yeah. Like, you can't
interpreting the world around you and your experiences.
Like that's what we're doing. So you can't just shut your brain off and not make those connections.
Yeah.
Like, I think that example is like, he experienced something, and all of a sudden it's like, I want to experience that more. How can I get that? And then all of a sudden you catch yourself and you think, it was like, well, that's not going to be the same. Like, it takes that thought, and it takes thinking through what that experience exposed in you emotionally and intellect as well. And then what do you do with that information?
Yeah.
You can't be, so maybe that's just a good way to end. Like, you have to be thinking through your experiences, not looking and pursuing and thinking, how can I get more of them?
Right.
But enjoying that experience, thinking through how that has blessed you, emotionally or affectionately, or through information, and you gleaned more information, or it built a relationship. Like, think through those things of how God has used that experience to shape you and to mold you
and to point you back to him ultimately. Let me just say one thing real quick. So next week I'm going to Boundary Waters. This will be like the 5th time I've been to Boundary Waters with my dad and this other guy who used to be my scoutmaster. The first time we went was with the Boy Scout troop. There were a bunch of different guys. We had to split up into two groups. So it was my dad and this other guy, and then my scoutmaster and this other guy. And so I didn't really get to spend that much time with my scoutmaster on that trip. Then we went again, and it was just my dad and the scoutmaster and his son. And then we went again, and it was just my dad and my sister and the scoutmaster. And then we went again, and you get the picture. It's different each time. And we're getting ready to go again, and it's going to be my dad, my scoutmaster, his sons, a couple of his grandsons, and myself. Now, each of those experiences has been amazing, but in different ways. There have been different relational aspects. There's been I've learned different things through those experiences. There's been different beauty. We've been to different sections of Boundary Waters. I could very easily set one of those up as the standard and then be like, if this doesn't meet that standard, it was a failure. And in the whole process of that, I miss what this is.
Yep.
And that's sort of like, I think, how we need to work through this. Like the Boundary Waters this time is going to be different than past times, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be good, and it's only going to be that way if I don't try to recreate something or lament that I don't have something that happened in the past. Right. And if I'm taking that and seeing it as an avenue to enjoy God in a new way, because we're actually going back to the same place we went the first time. And I have really fond memories of that. So I can rejoice in those memories even as I'm on this trip, but it's got to be its own thing.
Yep.
So
with that, hopefully that's helpful. We will finish up.
Drink water.
Sorry, I had a little thing. We will finish up the last leg of this information the next time we record, but we're probably going to take a few weeks off. So you're going to be on vacation next week, and then I'm starting my vacation the week after that. So cliffhanger. Not really.
What are we going to say about information?
I don't know. Like, we have to be careful, like, just honestly, because I think we value information, but we tend to harp on people because we see a weakness in people that faith is all about gleaning information you come to faith and the gospel affects you, and that's the information you need, and you had an experience and you have affections, but then the rest of our Christian life is an intellectual pursuit.
Right.
That's a weakness that we see, and so we tend to be hard on that. So I think it'll actually be good for us to think through it for a little while.
Take a little breather and figure out how to approach that in a balanced way.
So we'll be back then, whenever that is, for another episode of the Pastor Discussions Podcast, your weekly conversation on doctrine, faith, and the Christian life.